You clicked because you saw it too. The lot full of nearly new trucks. The line of people at the counter, keys in hand, walking away from the biggest purchase of their year. And somewhere in the back of your mind, a quiet voice asked whether you're the fool for still paying on yours. Here's the truth nobody at that dealership will tell you. The new truck was never the problem. The problem is that we forgot how to make a truck last. And an old Canadian habit that once kept a work vehicle alive for 25 winters got buried on purpose. I know. Because I paid for that lesson with a truck I loved and a bill I'll never forget. Stay with me, because by the end I'm going to hand you a method that turned up in a National Research Council report out of Ottawa from the 1960s, a method a handful of prairie farmers never stopped using. It costs less than 1 tank of fuel, and it works on the exact truck sitting in your driveway right now. Let me take you back to the winter of 2009, my driveway in Sudbury, cold enough that the snow squeaked. I slid under my Ford to check a noise, put a wrench on a brake line, and the line crumbled in my fingers like a dry biscuit. The truck was 9 years old, the engine ran like a watch. But underneath, the salt had eaten it hollow, and the shop wanted more to fix it than the truck was worth. I did what they wanted me to do. I signed for a new one, $61,000 over 7 years. And I told myself that was just the cost of living in this country. I was wrong. And it took me years to understand how wrong. So let me start where the pain starts, because if you drive in Canada, this is already happening to you whether you can see it or not. Every autumn, the trucks go out and behind them come the plows and the spreaders. On our roads, we pour down something like 5 million tons of road salt every single winter. That is not a made-up number. That is the scale of it across this country year after year, and every grain of it is looking for bare metal. Now here is the part that should make you angry. Salt does not rust your truck from the top. It works from underneath, where you never look. It splashes up into the frame rails, into the seams, into the little pockets behind your wheel wells where water sits and never dries. By the time you see a bubble in the paint, the steel behind it is already half gone. I used to think rust was slow. It is not. Researchers who study road salt found that salt water can make steel corrode dozens of times faster than plain rainwater. Not a little faster, dozens of times. That noise I heard under my Ford was 3 winters of damage. I could have stopped in an afternoon if anyone had ever told me how. But nobody told me. And that silence is worth money to a lot of people. Hold that thought, because it gets worse before it gets better. Here's the small win first, so you don't leave this spot without something you can use tonight. Go out to your truck, get down low, or use your phone camera and reach it under the back. Look at the frame rails behind the rear wheels and the seams under the doors. If you see orange dust or flaking that looks like pie crust, your truck is already talking to you. That 5 minutes just told you more than the dealership ever will, and it costs nothing. But finding the rust is not fixing it. And the reason your grandfather's truck outlived yours has nothing to do with the steel being better back then. It has to do with what he did every fall that we stopped doing. So let me tell you what changed. There was a time in this country when a truck was expected to last. Not 5 years, 20. A farmer near Brandon, a logger up past Timmins, a fisherman on the shore, these men could not just sign for a new one every time the frame got soft. So they protected the frame before the salt ever touched it. The method was almost stupidly simple. Every autumn, before the first heavy snow, they coated the underside of the vehicle in oil. Not fancy oil, whatever they had. Used motor oil drained from the crankcase, sometimes mixed with a little something to make it cling. They'd get under there with a brush or a cheap sprayer and paint every frame rail, every seam, every bolt they could reach. And it worked, because of something so basic we laugh at it now. Rust needs 3 things: metal, oxygen, and water. That's it. The oil forms a skin the water can't get through. No water on the steel, no rust. The salt lands on the oil and slides off with the next thaw. The frame stays dry underneath even when the whole truck is dripping. The National Research Council in Ottawa studied this cold country corrosion problem going back to the 1960s, when the government first started dumping salt on highways at a scale we'd never seen. Their building and materials people documented what salt does to steel in a freeze-and-thaw climate like ours. The science was never a secret. The farmers already knew it in their bones. What got lost was the habit. So, here is what to actually do, and I want you to hear how simple it is. Once a year, in October, before the roads turn white, you get an oil-based coating up into the frame and the seams. You can pay a shop to spray it. You can do it yourself in a driveway with a jack, a pair of stands, and a $2 pump sprayer. You want the underside wet with it, dripping a little, especially inside the frame rails where the rot always starts. That's the whole trick. One afternoon a year. Do that, and the difference is not small. I've watched trucks in this country cross the 250,000-kilometer mark with frames as clean as the day they left the line, purely because somebody kept the oil on. That is a truck that owes you nothing. That is $50,000 and $60,000 you never have to borrow again. So why did we stop? Why did a habit that saved every working family real money just quietly disappear? Because somewhere along the way, keeping your truck alive stopped being good for business. And here is where I have to introduce you to the people who benefited from your not knowing. Think about who loses money when your truck lasts 20 years. The dealer who wants you back on the lot every 5. The lender who makes far more on the interest than the metal is ever worth. And the manufacturer who long ago figured out that a truck which dies on schedule is a truck that sells twice. I'm not telling you they poured the salt. The salt keeps the roads safe, and that matters in a Sudbury winter. What I'm telling you is that once the salt was on the roads, an entire industry realized it did not need to protect your frame. In fact, it was better for them if your frame quietly rotted while the engine was still perfect. A rusted frame is the one thing that can total a truck that would otherwise run for another decade, and they knew it. So the annual oiling, the thing our fathers did without thinking, got left out of every owner's manual, every service reminder, every glossy ad. Nobody banned it. They just stopped mentioning it for 2 whole generations until people like you and me forgot it was ever a thing, and that is exactly why millions of people are walking those trucks back in this year. Interest went up, payments got heavy, and people looked at a 5-year-old truck already blistering with rust and did the math. They realized they were renting a vehicle that was designed to fall apart right around the time they finally owned it. So they're walking away from the new truck trap entirely. But walking away only helps you if you know how to keep the old one alive. Otherwise, you're just back in the same hole in a different truck. Now, I can already hear some of you, you're thinking, that's fine for a man with a garage and a jack and a Saturday to spare. I've got a carport, a bad back, and a truck I still have to drive to work Monday morning. This part is for you. I mean that. The next few minutes are built for the person who thinks this whole thing is for somebody else, because I was that person too, and I found out it fits any driveway and any budget. Here's the honest version for real life. You do not need a hoist. You do not need to be under there for hours. The single highest value spot on the whole truck is the frame behind and just ahead of the rear wheels, and the rocker seams under the doors. Those pockets trap salt and never dry. You can reach most of it lying on a piece of cardboard or even sitting on a low stool by the wheel with nothing but a cheap pump sprayer from the hardware store. And if you truly cannot get under a vehicle, here's the trick that saved me the year my back was worst. You buy a wand extension for that sprayer, about $1 or $2, and you feed it up into the frame rail through the drain holes the factory already put there. You're not even lifting the truck. You're standing beside it, feeding oil up into the hollow places where the rot begins, letting it run back down and coat everything on the way. 15 minutes aside. Renters, apartment folks, people with no tools at all, listen. Even if you never lift a wrench, you can walk into any independent shop in October and ask for an oil undercoating, sometimes called a drip oil spray. It runs somewhere around $150 in most of the country. Compare that to a new frame or a new truck. That is the cheapest insurance you will ever buy, and it works on a rusted truck too, because it stops what's already started from getting worse. The point is this: the old Canadians didn't have money either. That's the whole reason they figured this out. They protected what they had because they couldn't afford not to. This was never a rich man's trick. It was a poor man's shield, and it still is. But there's a catch, and I have to be straight with you about it, because it's the thing that trips people up and sends them right back to the dealership convinced the old way doesn't work. The oil does not last forever. That's the difference between the store-bought hard coatings and the old drip oil. The hard, rubbery undercoating they sprayed on trucks in the 1980s looked great, but it cracked over the winters, and water got in behind it and sat there against the steel, trapped, rusting in the dark where you couldn't see it. Thousands of trucks rotted worse because of that stuff, not better. That failure is a big part of why people gave up on rust protection altogether. They tried the wrong version once, watched it fail, and swore the whole idea was a scam. The old drip oil is the opposite. It stays soft. It creeps into the seams and keeps creeping. It heals itself when you scuff it because it flows. But because it stays soft, it drips off through the summer, and you have to put it back every single fall. That's not a flaw. That's the deal. One afternoon a year, forever, in exchange for a frame that never dies. Skip a couple of years, and the salt walks right back in. So, the real secret was never just the oil, it was the rhythm, the autumn ritual. And that brings me to the thing I promised you at the start, the piece I dug out that changed everything for me. Because plain used motor oil has one problem the old farmers were always fighting. Used motor oil is thin. It runs off fast, it washes away in a hard rain, and by January a lot of it is gone. The farmers knew this, so they were always mixing something into it to make it stick and to make it cling to the metal longer. And the best thing they ever found for that did not come from an oil can at all. It came off the back of a sheep. Let me tell you how I stumbled onto this, because I didn't believe it at first either. I was reading old accounts of how prairie families kept their tools and their machinery from rusting in barns that leaked and sweated all winter, and the same word kept coming up in the sheep country of the West. Wool grease, lanolin, the waxy grease that sheep make in their wool to keep the rain off their own skin. Here's what those old shepherds noticed generations ago. The hand shears, the hooks, the metal tools they used on the sheep, the ones that were always touching the raw wool, those tools never rusted. Everything else in the barn went orange. But anything that got smeared with that natural wool grease stayed clean and bright for years. The sheep were carrying the answer on their own backs the whole time. Lanolin is nature's own rust-proofing. It's waterproof, it clings to metal like nothing else, and it stays soft and creeping in the cold instead of cracking. Sheep evolved it to survive wet, freezing winters outdoors, which is exactly the punishment your truck frame takes every year in this country. It is the single best thing you can put on bare steel to keep water off it, and it has been sitting in plain sight on Canadian farms since the first settlers brought sheep over. So here is the finale. Here is the method, and I want you to write it down. You take an oil base so it flows and creeps into the seams. You melt in lanolin so it clings and stays put through the winter and won't wash off in the first thaw. You warm it gently so they blend, you let it cool to a soft grease, and you spray or brush it up into every frame rail, every seam, every hollow behind the wheels. The oil carries it deep. The lanolin makes it stay. And it does not crack, it does not trap water, and it heals itself when the road scuffs it. You can buy this already mixed now, if you don't want to melt anything. The lanolin-based sprays on the shelf today are the exact same idea, just poured into a can. But I want you to know the recipe. Because the recipe is the thing they took from us, and once you know it, nobody can ever sell you helplessness again. That knowledge was taken. Tonight you took it back, and if you want the full picture laid out in one place, every method, every material, every seasonal step, I put it all into a book called The Maple Reset. It covers this lanolin method in full detail, alongside a dozen other old Canadian techniques for keeping your home, your tools, and your vehicles out of the hands of people who profit from your forgetting. If that's the kind of practical knowledge you want on your shelf, the link is in the description. It's called The Maple Reset, and it exists because one afternoon of the right information is worth more than 10 years of the wrong payments. Now, let me give you the rest of the method, because the recipe is only half of it. Do this every October and you will never buy a frame. You will very likely never buy another truck out of desperation, only out of choice. The steel under your truck will outlast the payments, outlast the loan, outlast the whole idea that a vehicle is something you rent from the bank until it rots. That is what those farmers near Brandon knew. That is what the wool grease on an old pair of shears was quietly telling anyone who bothered to look. The knowledge never died. A few stubborn people in sheep country and on grain farms kept it alive while the rest of us forgot, and now I'm handing it to you, in your driveway, for the price of an afternoon. Let me pull this all the way back to that lot full of returned trucks, because now you can see it for what it really is. Those people aren't quitting on trucks, they're waking up. They finally saw that the machine was built to leave them, and that the payment was never buying them anything permanent. What they're missing, what almost none of them will find out, is that they didn't have to walk anything back. They could have kept the truck they had and simply refused to let it rot. I think about my old Ford more than I should. 9 years old, engine perfect, killed by a brake line that crumbled in my hand because nobody ever told me about a $2 sprayer and a can of oil and the grease off a sheep's back. That truck could have gone another 10 years. Somebody made good money off the fact that it didn't. I don't drive angry about it anymore. I drive protected. My truck now is older than that Ford ever got to be, and the frame under it is cleaner because every October, without fail, I get under there and I put the oil back on. One afternoon. Once a year. And the salt just slides off and leaves me alone. So, here is what I want you to feel walking away from this. You were never bad with money, and you were never careless with your truck. You were kept in the dark about a simple, cheap, proven thing that our own grandparents did without a second thought, because your forgetting was profitable to people who will never fix your frame for you. That knowledge was taken. Tonight you took it back. You're the kind of person who has always suspected that the old ways worked better and got pushed aside for a reason. You were right. You were right the whole time. Trust that instinct, because it's the thing that will keep money in your pocket for the rest of your life. Now I need one thing from you, and I'm asking you plainly because I know this crowd doesn't speak up unless somebody asks. I want you to go look at your own frame tonight, behind the rear wheels, in those seams under the doors, and I want you to come back here and tell me what you found. Orange dust, pie crust, flaking, or clean steel? Type it in the comments right now, and tell me where in the country you're watching from, because the salt in Sudbury is a different animal than the salt on the coast or the gravel and calcium roads out on the prairies, and I read every one of these. And if any part of tonight lit that old spark in you, the feeling that there's a whole shelf of this practical Canadian know-how that somebody quietly took down, then come stand with the rest of us who are putting it back up, one method at a time. This is a growing pile of people who refuse to be kept helpless in their own homes and their own driveways, because the next thing I'm going to show you is even closer to home than your truck. It's the reason your heating bill climbs every single winter no matter how low you set the thermostat, and it's a fix our grandmothers used on the coldest walls of the house that costs almost nothing. There's a specific old material they packed into one particular spot, and once you know where it goes, you'll feel the draft you never knew was robbing you. I found the trail of it in an old settler household record, and I can't wait to hand it to you. Before you go, let me make sure you really have this, because I don't want you to walk away with a nice feeling and no plan. A nice feeling doesn't stop rust, a plan does. October, that's your month. Not November, when the salt is already down. Not December, when it's frozen to the frame. October, while the metal is still dry and warm enough for the oil to creep. Mark it on whatever calendar you keep, the way you'd mark a birthday, because your truck's whole life depends on that one date more than any oil change ever printed in the manual. The tools. A pump sprayer, the cheap kind for garden weeds, works fine. A wand extension so you can feed it up into the frame through the drain holes. A pair of old clothes you'll throw out, because this is messy work and I won't lie to you about that. A piece of cardboard to lie on, or a low stool if your back is like mine. That's the whole kit, and it'll cost you less than a single restaurant dinner. The oil? If you're going to buy it ready-made, ask for a lanolin-based rust protection spray, and don't let anyone talk you into the hard rubbery undercoating that dries stiff. Stiff is the enemy. Stiff cracks, and cracks trap water, and trapped water is exactly the death you're trying to prevent. Soft and creeping is what you want. Soft self-heals. Soft is what the sheep figured out 1,000 years before we did. The targets, in order of how much they matter. First, inside the frame rails, up through the holes, because that hollow steel is where the rot always starts and where you can never see it until it's too late. Second, the seams under the doors, the rocker panels, where the doors meet the body. Third, behind and in front of the rear wheels, that whole splash zone. Fourth, every brake line and fuel line you can reach, because that's the exact part that crumbled in my hand and cost me a truck. Get those 4 zones wet with the oil and let it drip. Done. And when the neighbors ask why your truck is dripping oil in the driveway every fall, tell them the truth. Tell them you found out what the farmers near Brandon knew, what the National Research Council in Ottawa put in writing back in the 1960s, and what the sheep on every prairie farm have been quietly proving since before this country had highways. Tell them it costs 1 afternoon a year, and it kills the single thing that murders good trucks. Some of them will laugh. And in 12 years, when your truck is still on the road and theirs is scrap, they won't be laughing anymore. I spent $61,000 learning this the hard way. You just learned it for free, sitting right where you are. The only thing left is whether you'll go outside and use it, or whether you'll let the salt keep eating while somebody waits patiently for you back at that lot. I already know which kind of person you are. You made it all the way to the end, and the people who make it to the end are the people who actually do the thing. So go do it. Find your October, get the oil, keep your truck, And keep the money that was always supposed to be yours. The salt starts falling soon. Beat it there. If you stayed with me this far, here's what I'd love for you. This video gave you the overview, but inside the Northern Ways circle, I take you all the way through the frame oiling method, picking up right where we left off. Ask me your own question there, and a real person answers. Not a machine. You belong with us. Just point your phone's camera at the code on screen. Cancel anytime with one click.